They say a wedding is the happiest day of your life. But as I stood in my white gown, trembling under the gaze of 300 guests, I wasn't thinking about happily ever after. I was thinking about the piece of paper burning a hole in my palm, a note my mother had just slipped me with a smile that could freeze hell over. It wasn't a blessing, it was a timer. In that split second, the mask slipped. I realized my mother hadn't spent thousands on these flowers to celebrate my union. She had orchestrated this entire event to stage my public execution. She expected me to crumble. She expected the old, fragile Brooke to run crying into the bathroom, giving her exactly the breakdown she needed to lock me away forever. But she made one fatal mistake. She thought I was still her victim. If you think this is just another story about a controlling mother-in-law, you are wrong. This is a survival story. You are about to witness how I took a terrifying legal trap set 20 years in the making and turned it into the most satisfying, ruthless counterattack you will ever hear. I didn't just survive my mother's gift. I used it to bury her. I walked down that aisle, smiling, not because I was happy, but because in that moment, I had already decided exactly how I was going to destroy her. My name is Brooke Davis, a 34-year-old hospice care manager who has spent a decade guiding families through their darkest final moments with clarity, grace, and professional detachment. I was trained to spot the subtle signs of decline in the dying, the shift in breathing, the glazing of the eyes, yet I remained blissfully, willfully blind to the calculated malice growing in the woman who gave me birth. I had always been the quiet one, the steady hand holding others as they let go, while my mother, Evelyn, was the whirlwind that demanded to be held. The reception at the country club was a masterpiece of pale gold and cream, a vision of elegance that Evelyn had curated down to the very last napkin ring. To the 300 guests sipping expensive champagne, it looked like a mother's labor of love, a selfless gift to her only daughter. But I knew better. It was a stage set, and I was merely a prop she was maneuvering into the spotlight. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies, a flower I had told her I hated because they reminded me of funerals, but she had insisted they were classic. Every compliment from a distant aunt or family friend was directed at her, praising her generosity, her taste, and her endless sacrifice. I stood by the head table, my smile plastered on like a mask, listening as she held court. I overheard her whispering to Mrs. Gable from the church. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush that was meant to be heard by anyone within a 5-foot radius. "We're just hoping she makes it through the night without an incident," she said, shaking her head with performative sadness, touching her pearls as if clutching a rosary. "She's so fragile lately. Marriage is such a pressure cooker for someone with her specific disposition." I stiffened, my grip tightening on my husband's hand until my knuckles turned white, but I said nothing. I never did. In Evelyn's world, silence was the rent I paid to exist. The orchestra swelled, signaling the speeches, and Evelyn approached me, her eyes shimmering with unshed, practiced tears. She held 2 crystal flutes, distinct from the generic glassware on the tables, etched with delicate vines. "A special toast," she announced, her voice trembling just enough to sound maternal to the audience, though her eyes were dry and hard as flint. "For my baby girl. Just us." She pressed the cold glass into my hand. I hesitated, catching a flicker of something deliberate in her gaze, a challenge I couldn't quite decipher, but the pressure of 300 pairs of eyes forced me to lift the glass. I drank, it was crisp, sweet, and I swallowed it in a single gulp to end the moment. It started as a tingling in my fingertips, subtle at first, like the pins and needles of a limb falling asleep. Then, the numbness crawled up my arms, heavy and cold. Within 10 minutes, the room began to tilt. The faces of the guests smeared into a watercolor blur of beige and tuxedo black. As a nurse, I knew the difference between panic and pathology. Panic was a racing heart and shallow breath, a sharpness of the senses. This was different. This was heavy. This was chemical. My tongue felt too thick for my mouth when I tried to lean over to my husband. "I don't feel right," I tried to say, but the words came out as a garbled, drunken slur. I tried to stand, to get to fresh air, but my knees simply dissolved. I crumpled onto the polished dance floor, the silk of my dress pooling around me. The music screeched to a halt. A gasp ripped through the room. Through the haze, I looked up for my mother. She wasn't rushing toward me. She was standing perfectly still, watching me writhe on the floor, allowing the silence to stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds. She let everyone see the bride on her knees, incoherent and messy. She let the narrative of the unstable daughter sink into the collective consciousness of the room. Only then, when the humiliation was total, did she swoop down, her voice loud and commanding. "Give her space. I've got her. I know how to handle this." The next few minutes were a blur of being dragged, literally dragged into the bridal suite. My legs were useless dead weights, my expensive heels scraping against the floor. My husband tried to follow, panic written all over his face, but Evelyn slammed the door in his face with shocking strength. "She needs her mother right now, Mark. You'll just upset her more. Go handle the guests." She locked the door. The silence in the room was deafening compared to the chaos outside. The worried mother mask vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, clinical efficiency that chilled me more than the drugs in my veins. She didn't call 911. She didn't check my pulse. Instead, she reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope and a business card. She pressed them into my limp hand. My eyes struggled to focus on the card. "Serenity Hills Psychiatric Care." I blinked, trying to clear the fog. "You made a scene, Brooke," she whispered, her voice devoid of warmth, smooth as glass. "Just like I knew you would. But don't worry. I made calls last week. I booked you a room starting Tuesday." My heart hammered against my ribs, fighting the sedation. This wasn't a reaction to stress. She had planned this. She had drugged me in front of everyone to justify locking me away before I could legally bind my life to someone else. The note wasn't a get-well card. It was an admission slip. As my vision faded, I realized my mother wasn't holding me up to support me, she was holding me up so she could be the one to drag me away. The lock clicked shut with a finality that echoed in the silent room, sounding less like a latch securing a door and more like the first shovel of dirt hitting a casket. I was alone, sprawled on the velvet chaise where my mother had dumped me, the heavy silk of my wedding dress feeling like a shroud wrapping around my paralyzed limbs. The drug was working faster now, pulling me down into a thick, syrupy darkness, but as I fought to keep my eyes open, the terrified confusion began to curdle into a horrifying clarity. The sensation in my body, the specific, creeping heaviness in my chest, and the metallic taste coating the back of my throat wasn't new, but I hadn't felt it in my own body before. I had watched it destroy someone else. A memory, sharp and violent, pierced through the fog of the sedative. My father, 3 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table just weeks before he died. He had been a linebacker of a man, strong and immutable, until his retirement, when he suddenly began to wither away. I remembered the way his hand had trembled over his evening soup, a special broth Evelyn insisted on making him from scratch because his stomach was delicate. He had looked at me with glazed, confused eyes, complaining of the room spinning, his speech slurring exactly the way mine had just done on the dance floor. Back then, we had all praised Evelyn for her tireless devotion, for the way she guided him up the stairs, tucked him in, and isolated him from his friends so he could rest. We thought he was dying of a rare, inexplicable neurological decline, but lying there in the bridal suite, paralyzed by the same woman's hand, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father hadn't died of natural causes, he had died of care. He was systematically poisoned, weakened day by day, so that my mother could play the role of the grieving, saintly nurse, feeding off the sympathy of the community like a vampire feeds on blood. And now that he was gone, the role of the invalid was vacant. She didn't want a daughter who was independent and married. She needed a new patient to control, a new excuse for martyrdom, and I had just volunteered for the position by drinking that toast. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through me that momentarily warred with the sedative, giving me just enough strength to roll off the chaise. I couldn't close my eyes. If I slept now, I would wake up in a facility, labeled psychotic, with my blood scrubbed clean of the toxins by her treatment. I needed proof, and I needed it before she came back to transport me. My breathing was ragged as I dragged myself across the plush carpet toward the closet where I had stashed my overnight bag. Being a hospice manager meant I lived my life in a state of perpetual readiness, and my go bag was never without a basic medical kit. My fingers were clumsy, numb sausages that refused to cooperate, fumbling with the zipper until I nearly ripped the fabric, but finally I found it: a sterile butterfly needle, a tourniquet, and a vacuum-sealed collection vial. I had to be my own phlebotomist, a task that would be routine on a patient but felt like defusing a bomb with my own shaking hands. I tied the tourniquet around my upper arm, using my teeth to pull it tight because my left hand was useless. The vein in the crook of my elbow was sluggish, hard to find under the stress, but I slapped the skin until a faint blue line appeared. I uncapped the needle, the room spinning like a carousel, and jabbed it in. Dark red blood flowed into the vial, undeniable, biological truth. This wasn't hysteria, this was a chemical assault. I filled 2 vials, sealing them with trembling fingers, labeling them with the date and time, using a marker from the kit. This was the scientific countermove she never expected from the daughter she deemed fragile. I crawled to the balcony door, cracking it open just enough to slide the vials into the planter box outside, then fumbled for my phone to text Dr. Eris, a trusted pathologist I had worked with for a decade. Emergency. Talk screen needed immediately. Don't come to the door. Pick up from balcony planter. Mom poisoning me. Sending that text felt like firing a flare gun from a sinking ship, but as the message status changed to delivered, another terrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Why today? Why ruin the wedding she had spent a fortune on? The answer wasn't emotional, it was legal. In the eyes of the law, the moment that marriage license was filed on Monday morning, my husband Mark would become my legal next of kin. He would have the power to make medical decisions for me, to ban my mother from my hospital room, to take me away from her. The wedding ceremony had happened, but the paperwork wasn't processed yet. We were in a legal gray zone, the limbo weekend. Evelyn knew that if she could prove I had a psychotic break tonight, if she could get a doctor to declare me incompetent and a danger to myself before the courthouse opened on Monday, she could file for an emergency conservatorship. She could argue that the marriage was invalid because I was not of sound mind when I said I do. She wasn't just trying to ruin my night, she was racing against the clock to annul my husband's rights and legally reclaim ownership of my body and mind before we could leave for our honeymoon. The gift she gave me wasn't a tragedy. It was a preemptive strike. I leaned back against the wall, the empty syringe casing in my hand, listening to the muffled sounds of the party continuing downstairs without the bride. My mother thought she was putting a sick child to bed, but she had just awakened the only witness to her crimes. Monday morning broke over the city, not with the promise of a new beginning, but with the terrifying precision of a steel trap snapping shut. I had spent Sunday hiding in my apartment with the blinds drawn, detoxing from the sedatives and waiting for the other shoe to drop, and at 9:05 a.m., it did. My phone vibrated with a call from a number I recognized immediately. Brenda, a clerk at the probate court, whom I had befriended over years of filing paperwork for my hospice patients. Her voice was hushed, urgent, the kind of whisper used when someone knows they are breaking protocol. She told me that my mother was currently standing at the filing window, submitting an emergency ex parte petition for temporary conservatorship over my person and estate. The legal term chilled my blood faster than the drug had. Ex parte meant one-sided. A hearing where the judge would hear only her side of the story because the situation was deemed too dangerous to wait for a defense. Brenda described the evidence Evelyn had attached to the petition. A flash drive containing the high-definition video of my collapse at the wedding, zoomed in to show my rolling eyes and slurred speech, and a thick stack of affidavits. Evelyn had falsified 6 months of care logs, documenting imaginary manic episodes, fabricated suicidal threats, and incidents of confusion that never happened. She wasn't just claiming I had a bad night. She was constructing a paper trail of chronic instability that dated back months, making the wedding incident look like the inevitable, tragic climax of a deteriorating mind. The public nature of the drugging finally made sadistic sense. She hadn't just wanted to embarrass me. She had needed a room full of witnesses to corroborate the lie that I was a danger to myself, allowing her to bypass the usual requirement for a psychiatric evaluation and strip me of my rights before lunch. My husband, Mark, was in the bedroom, zipping up our suitcases, oblivious to the legal noose tightening around my neck. "We need to leave, Brooke," he called out, his voice thick with stress. "The car for the airport is here in 20 minutes. Once we're in Italy, we can figure this out away from her." I looked at the open passports on the counter, and a second wave of realization washed over me, colder than the first. The honeymoon wasn't an escape route, it was the final door of the cage. If I got on that plane, I was playing directly into her script. I realized with sickening clarity that if my mother was bold enough to drug me at my wedding, she had almost certainly tampered with my luggage or toiletries. All it would take was a planted bottle of pills found by TSA, or another dose of sedative slipping into my drink on the flight, to trigger an international incident. If I had a breakdown in a foreign country, local authorities would look for the nearest blood relative to take custody. Evelyn would fly in, playing the hero mother rescuing her incompetent daughter from a husband who couldn't handle her, and she would use medical repatriation laws to fly me straight back to a locked facility in the States, bypassing Mark entirely. Running would make me look guilty. Running would make me look unstable. Leaving the jurisdiction was exactly what a flight risk would do, and it would give the judge every reason to grant her permanent control the moment I was dragged back to American soil. I walked into the bedroom and placed my hand over Mark's, stopping him from closing the suitcase. I saw the confusion in his eyes, the fear that I really was cracking under the pressure, and I knew I had to shatter his innocence to save us both. I didn't argue. I simply pulled up the email confirmation from the lab on my phone, the one acknowledging the receipt of a priority toxicology screening, and showed it to him. I explained the ex parte filing, the fake logs, and the trap waiting for us at the airport. I watched his face shift from confusion to horror, and finally, to a hard, angry resolve. "We aren't going to Italy," I told him, my voice steady for the first time in days. "We are staying right here. If we run, she wins. We need more than just blood in a vial. We need her to say it. We need a confession that proves intent." We devised a plan that required me to do the one thing I had spent my entire adult life avoiding: becoming the victim she wanted me to be. We set up his laptop in the living room, angling the webcam to cover the sofa, covering the recording light with a piece of tape. I needed to lure her into the open, to make her feel so safe in her victory that she would brag about the kill. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother, preparing to give the performance of my life to save my life. I spent the next 20 minutes destroying my own living room, staging the scene with the meticulous detail of a crime scene investigator. I pulled the curtains tight to blot out the afternoon sun, threw throw pillows haphazardly onto the floor to suggest a struggle with frustration, and rubbed raw onion on my eyes to induce the red, swollen look of hysterical weeping. Mark had retreated to the car parked down the street, ready to act as backup if things went wrong, leaving me alone with the silent, blinking eye of the webcam hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of a thick medical textbook on the shelf. When the knock finally came, 3 sharp raps that sounded more like a summons than a visit, I took a deep breath, slumped my shoulders, and opened the door to let the wolf in. Evelyn stood there, immaculate in a pressed linen suit, holding a Tupperware container and her oversized purse. I didn't say hello. I just collapsed into her arms, sobbing about how Mark had left. How I couldn't stop shaking. How the noise in my head wouldn't stop. I felt her stiffen for a moment, and then she relaxed, patting my back with a rhythmic, heavy hand. I led her to the sofa, making sure she sat facing the bookshelf, and curled up into a ball next to her. I looked up at her with wide, wet eyes and delivered the line I had rehearsed a dozen times, the key that I prayed would unlock her darkest truth. "Mom," I whispered, grabbing her hand. "I'm scared. I don't think I can do this life anymore. Please, just take care of me. Take care of me exactly like you took care of Dad." The effect was instantaneous. The tension in her jaw unspooled, and a look of serene, terrifying satisfaction settled over her features. She squeezed my hand, her eyes gleaming with the validation she craved. "Oh, honey," she cooed, reaching for her purse. "I knew this would happen. Mark is a nice boy, but he's not family. He doesn't have the stomach for this kind of maintenance. He would have left you eventually, just like your father's friends left him." She pulled out a small orange prescription bottle with no label and popped the cap. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, as she brazenly crushed 2 white pills into a powder, using the bottom of a heavy coaster, and stirred them into the glass of water she had poured for me. She didn't even try to hide it. She believed I was too broken to notice, or perhaps she believed she had the right. As she stirred, the spoon clinking softly against the glass, she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Your father was difficult at the end, too, you know. He fought me. He didn't want the medicine. He thought he could get better, but I knew the truth. I had to make the hard choices to keep him calm. I had to help him let go of the struggle. And look how peaceful he was at the end. I saved him from himself, Brooke. And now I'm going to save you. She handed me the glass, the water cloudy with sediment. Drink this, she commanded softly. It will make the noise stop. I took the glass with trembling hands, raising it to my lips. This was a trick I had learned from the most stubborn patients in the hospice ward, the cheek, and spit. I tilted the glass, let the liquid hit my closed teeth, and then dramatically gulped, while actually letting the water pool in the hollow of my cheek. I grabbed a tissue from the coffee table, pretending to wipe my mouth, and spit the liquid into the wad of paper, crumbling it instantly in my fist. I coughed, feigning the bitterness of the pill. "Thank you, Mom," I rasped. "I just want to sleep." Evelyn smiled, a genuine, beatific smile that chilled me to the bone. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a sleek folder. "I know, sweetheart. And you will. I just need you to sign these papers so I can get you into that nice place I told you about. It just gives Mommy permission to drive you there and talk to the doctors for you." It was a voluntary commitment form and a durable power of attorney. I took the pen she offered. My hand shook, not from acting, but from the sheer adrenaline of the moment. I signed my name at the bottom, Brooke Davis, but where the line asked for the date, I deliberately wrote the year as 2024 instead of 2026. It was a small clerical error, but in the world of legal contracts, an incorrect date on a document executed under duress would be the first thread my lawyer would pull to unravel the whole tapestry. Evelyn didn't check the date. She only checked the signature. She snapped the folder shut, stood up, and smoothed her skirt. "You rest now," she said, looking at me with the pity one reserves for a dying pet. "I'll go get the car and call the facility. Pack a bag." She walked out the door with a smile, clutching the papers she thought were her victory, unaware she was carrying her own confession. The emergency hearing took place in the suffocating quiet of Judge Holloway's chambers on Tuesday morning, a room that smelled of old leather, floor wax, and the heavy weight of judgment. My lawyer, a shark of a man named Mr. Vance, whom I had hired only hours before, had arranged for us to enter through the side door, so I was able to stand in the shadows and watch my mother perform her final, fatal act. Evelyn sat in the center of the room, a vision of maternal devastation in a modest navy dress, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief as she pleaded her case. She was magnificent in her deception, her voice trembling with just the right frequency of heartbreak as she described my downward spiral to the judge. On the large monitor mounted on the wall, the video of my wedding collapse played on a loop, my legs giving out, my eyes rolling back, the incoherent slurring of my speech. It was a damning piece of theater, edited to strip away the context and leave only the image of a woman completely undone. "I tried to protect her," Evelyn sobbed, leaning forward to grasp the judge's sympathy with both hands. "I tried to keep this private, Your Honor. But after she tried to hurt herself again yesterday, I just can't watch my little girl die. I need the authority to get her the help she refuses to accept." Judge Holloway, a man in his 60s who likely saw his own daughter in her plea, was nodding slowly, his pen hovering over the order that would strip me of my autonomy and hand my life over to the woman who wanted to end it. The terror in the room was palpable. I was watching the legal system, designed to protect the vulnerable, being weaponized by a predator who knew exactly which buttons to push. Mr. Vance placed a firm hand on my shoulder, signaling that it was time to stop the show. We stepped into the light. "I object to this entire proceeding based on fraudulent evidence, Your Honor," Vance announced, his voice slicing through the thick emotional atmosphere like a scalpel. Evelyn spun around in her chair, and for a split second, the mask slipped. Her eyes widened, not with relief at seeing me alive, but with the sheer, white-hot fury of a director whose play has been interrupted. She quickly recovered, reaching out a hand toward me. "Brooke! Oh, thank God you're here. You see, Your Honor?" She's confused. She doesn't know what she's doing. But I didn't flinch, and I didn't look at her. I looked straight at the judge. I wasn't the trembling, slurring mess on the screen. I was standing tall, dressed in a sharp blazer, my eyes clear and cold. Mr. Vance didn't waste time with arguments. He walked to the bench and slid a single document across the mahogany surface. Exhibit A, Your Honor, he said calmly. This is a toxicology report from a blood sample drawn by Mrs. Davis Miller herself immediately following the incident on the video. The chain of custody was verified by LabCorp. It shows nearly 3 times the therapeutic dose of diazepam and muscle relaxants in her system, drugs she has never been prescribed, but which her mother has had a standing prescription for since 2015. The silence that followed was absolute. The judge picked up the paper, his brows knitting together as he scanned the timestamps and the chemical breakdown. The science was objective, cold, and irrefutable. It instantly shattered the subjective narrative of the hysterical daughter. Evelyn's face drained of color, but she was a veteran manipulator, and she pivoted instantly. "She must have stolen them from my purse," she cried out, her voice pitching up into indignation. "She's an addict, Your Honor. This just proves she needs my help even more. She drugged herself to get attention." It was a desperate lie, but a dangerous one, the kind that could plant a seed of doubt. I saw the judge hesitate, looking back and forth between the weeping mother and the stoic daughter. That was when I nodded to Vance. "Exhibit B," I said softly. Vance opened his laptop and turned the screen toward the judge. He pressed play. The audio filled the small chambers, clearer and more damning than any testimony. It was the sound of my mother's voice from yesterday afternoon, casual and cruel. "Your husband will never have the patience for you. I had to help your father let go. I had to make the hard choices to keep him calm." On the screen, the judge watched the woman sitting in front of him crush pills into a fine powder and stir them into a glass of water, handing it to her daughter with a smile. It was a video of a predator grooming her prey. The transformation in Judge Holloway was terrifying to behold. The sympathy evaporated from his face, replaced by a look of dawning horror and revulsion. He looked from the screen, where Evelyn was confessing to slowly killing her husband, to the woman sitting before him, who had suddenly shrunk into her chair. The air left the room. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to spin another web, but no sound came out. She looked at me, pleading with her eyes for me to stop this, to return to the script, but I just stared back, unmoved. Mr. Vance closed the laptop with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. "Your Honor," he said, "we are not just asking for a dismissal. We are filing an immediate cross-petition for a protective order and formally requesting an investigation into elder abuse regarding the death of Franklin Davis and attempted harm regarding my client." The arrogance that had fueled Evelyn for decades, the certainty that she was smarter than everyone else, finally collapsed under the weight of her own recorded hubris. The judge didn't just dismiss her case. He looked at my mother and asked the bailiff to lock the doors. The click of the lock on the courtroom door didn't signal the end of the war, but it did mark the beginning of the surrender. In the heavy silence that followed the judge's order, my mother didn't scream or fight. She simply deflated, collapsing into herself like a dying star running out of fuel. Mr. Vance and I had prepared for this moment, knowing that a criminal trial for attempted poisoning and elder abuse would be a long, public spectacle that would allow Evelyn to play the martyr on the nightly news for months. I didn't want to give her another stage, and I didn't want to spend the first year of my marriage testifying against my own mother in a cold witness box. So, we offered her a mercy she didn't deserve, but one that served my need for peace perfectly. We presented a plea deal, a quiet arrangement that would keep her out of prison but effectively end her reign of terror. She could avoid jail time if she voluntarily entered the Kensington, a high-security, luxury-assisted living facility. 2 towns over the very same golden cage she had once threatened to put my father in, when he became too difficult to control. But the true genius of the deal lay in the financial terms. In exchange for dropping the charges, Evelyn had to surrender her power of attorney, not to me, but to a court-appointed professional guardian. Her vast estate, the money she had used as a weapon to manipulate everyone around her for decades, would now be managed by a stranger, a neutral, bureaucratic fiduciary who wouldn't care about her tears, her guilt trips, or her fabricated emergencies. She would be comfortable, well-fed, and safe, but she would be utterly, completely powerless. A month later, I drove to the Kensington to visit her for the first time. The facility was beautiful in a sterile, manicured way, with high ceilings, fresh flowers that were changed daily, and a staff of nurses who smiled with professional detachment. Walking down the hallway, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, realizing this was exactly the kind of environment Evelyn had tried to force me into, only now, the roles were reversed. I found her in the solarium, sitting alone in a wingback chair, staring out at the garden. She looked immaculate, her hair perfectly coiffed, but there was a hollowness to her expression that I had never seen before. When she saw me, her eyes lit up with a flicker of the old spark, a desperate hunger for an audience. She immediately launched into a litany of complaints. The staff was rude, the food was bland, the guardian wouldn't authorize the release of funds for a new wardrobe. She tried to grab my hand, her grip tight and demanding, pulling me into her orbit. "You have to get me out of here, Brooke," she hissed, lowering her voice. "They treat me like a child. They don't listen to a word I say. I'm your mother. After everything I did for you, how can you leave me with these people?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a monster. I saw a small, sad woman who was starving because she had no one left to consume. The nurses here were kind, but they were impervious to her manipulation. They didn't need her approval, and they weren't afraid of her anger. She was trapped in a world where her currency, guilt, and fear had no value. I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my wrist, placing her hand back in her own lap. "They treat you like a resident, Mom," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the anger I used to carry. "They keep you safe. That's what you always wanted for Dad, remember? Safety." I stood up and adjusted the blanket over her knees, tucking the edges in with the same efficient, practiced motion I used for my hospice patients. It was a gesture of care, but it was detached, the way one cares for a stranger. She tried to protest, to twist my words, but I stepped back, out of her reach. I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was a visitor. I wasn't her victim. I was the one holding the keys to the outside world. She realized it then, sinking back into her chair, the silence of the room swallowing her complaints. Walking out through the automatic doors into the parking lot, the air hit my lungs with a sweetness I hadn't tasted in years. Mark was waiting for me in the car, the engine idling, ready to take us to our rescheduled honeymoon, but I paused for a moment on the sidewalk. For years, I had been taught that honoring your parents meant submission, that being a good daughter meant setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. I finally understood that was a lie designed to keep abusers in power. Honoring my father meant ensuring his tormentor could never hurt anyone else. Honoring myself meant walking away. I had broken the cycle. The guilt I expected to feel was absent, replaced by a profound, quiet relief. The generational curse stopped with me. I got into the car and closed the door, sealing the past behind me. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the imposing brick building one last time, knowing she was exactly where she needed to be. I didn't put my mother in a home to punish her. I put her there to make sure she never has another patient again. That brings us to the end of Brooke's harrowing journey of survival and justice. It takes immense strength to recognize when care has turned into control and to walk away from the parent who gave you life in order to save your own. Now I want to turn the conversation over to you because your life experience brings such value to this discussion. Do you think Brooke made the right choice by offering her mother a plea deal to keep her out of prison? Or do you believe Evelyn deserved to spend her final years behind bars for what she did to Brooke's father? Was the assisted living facility a mercy, or the ultimate poetic justice for a woman who needed to control everything? I know many of you have navigated difficult family dynamics and had to make impossible choices, and I would truly value hearing your wisdom and opinions in the comments section below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, and you want to see more content about women finding their strength and fighting back against the odds, please support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and liking this video. Your support helps us share more of these powerful true stories with the community. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.